step of things, here you go.
And if you, as you join us, if you're already on with us, we want to be able to tell you that we'd ask that you would share the page, do the work with people. And after today's video, if you find that helpful, we encourage you to share that and do that with other people and help them to be able to. I think we're live. Now we're finally live. All right. So we'd like you to share the page with people. We're still figuring all this stuff out. And be able to make sure that if you enjoy these videos, share those with other folks so that they can be able to share that with, again, other people. I can get some feedback. There we go. All right. So, Phil, we're going to get into this. I've rambled on enough. I think we're ready to go as we figure all this out. We're using a new app, by the way, for those people who don't understand. It causes us to maybe not be as efficient as we should. So we're going to give you today 4 reasons why we believe churches don't grow, and hopefully this will be a good discussion with all of us. If you have questions or comments, please put those in the Facebook Live, and we're monitoring that. We'll be able to discuss that with you as we do. So Phil, let's start off with number 4, and I'll let you go ahead and introduce number 4. It is...
We don't plan to grow. I think there's a number of factors that go into the growth concept that require us to kind of reevaluate our process. Years ago, preaching in Wilsonville, Oregon, the congregation there for the time was meeting in a rented facility. It was a Grange Hall. And we had a number of families that would visit with us. And me wanting to know what was going on and maybe why they didn't come back a second time or a third time, I'd always just give them a call and just ask them straight out, hey, loved meeting you. Maybe I knew them already. Tell me more about what made you uncomfortable there, or what didn't draw you back a second time or a third time to come and talk to us a little bit more. And one of the things that was always consistent in that particular time frame for that particular group is that because of where we're meeting, we were meeting at a time, it was an old building and it was not pleasant to be in. You kind of got used to the smell, just to be blunt. And a lot of folks would be like, man, it bothers my allergies, all those things that for the mature Christian who is already committed to doing God's work, that not really as big of a deal in some ways, but to the outsider who's already fragile in their decision process, it may seem small to somebody else, but to them it was massive. And in some cases, it was a barrier. They just weren't willing to go over a second time. And really, at least from the institutional, structural, congregational, corporate side, it's not about the first visit. It's about getting them to consider the gospel on the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth step, if you will, of their emotional process. And there's a lot of facility issues, a lot of structural issues with growth that I think are important in that same way.
Yeah, I think we have a kind of a quaint notion here, I call it a quaint old notion, that because we teach the gospel, the way the building looks and some of those things shouldn't matter, and occupancy shouldn't matter. One of the things that if you study church growth, you know guys like Tom Rayner and others that have looked at all that is once you hit 80% capacity, you've got to have a plan to do something to increase your capacity. And I've heard a lot of people just kind of look down on that idea and say, no, that's not true. And yet I can look at some congregations that have grown past that. They swelled past that 80%, and then they'll have a problem of some kind, and they'll shrink back down to about 70, maybe sometimes 60%. They'll grow back to 80. It'll be a different problem, and it's never that they say, well, there's not enough seats, but there's always something. When you get to too many people in an auditorium, it's like too many people in an elevator. I don't know if you thought about that, but if I'm somewhere and there's too many people in the elevator, I'm a big guy anyway. There's too many people in the elevator, I'm going to find some justification to not get on that elevator. And that's kind of what happens in a church building. And so planning to grow, and it includes not just the number of seats. I was with one group one time that the bathrooms were just, quite frankly, horrible. And it was one of those deals where years ago they built their own building and they made all the bathroom dividers out of plywood. And quite frankly, in the men's room, you open the door and you could see the two urinals right as the door opened. And it was just an uncomfortable thing. The nursery was actually a hallway to the ladies' restroom. What nursing mother wants to sit in there while people are going in and out? And when we would talk about that, there was this idea, well, it doesn't matter. That just doesn't matter. And it does. It does matter. And so if you're not
Yeah.
handling those situations, you're not planning to grow.
Yeah, I'll add this one little tidbit to it. All of these accommodations, of temporary use need to really be treated as what they are, temporary. I absolutely understand and recognize, and sometimes that we have to work around this on the short run, but none of these short run solutions should become the de facto solution if your goal is to be receptive to what God will do with you. If you're only going to go so far out on the ledge and out on the bridge, those choices, I guess, would be suitable if you're not really willing to go as far as God wants to pull you across to the other side. And growth issues all mix in a bit of push and a bit of pull on the present tense.
Yeah, I would add too, I know those are physical things we've talked about mainly, and some people would say, well, that's all physical. That doesn't have anything to do with evangelism. But quite frankly, the reality is when you talk about evangelism, you are largely talking about people who don't understand the gospel, who are not necessarily looking for what we would call the truth. They're looking for a church family and a place to take their kids to Bible class or something along those lines, which is an opening in that sense for you to be able to teach them the gospel. And so the reality is there's a lot of competition in that area. This Sunday we had 32 visitors with us and 148 people total. Large portion of those were what we would classify as non-members and probably non-Christians. And if they came in and we didn't have the place for them to be accommodated in those physical ways, they're going to go next door to a denomination who does have those things.
Yeah. Another way just to quickly get the metaphor out there, and we're going to move forward, I think, is just to think about it in this very simple sense. The first visit is the open door. What they see when you open the door is what you want them to come back to. And you want them to come back to an opportunity to hear the gospel. You want them to come back to an opportunity to grow, and you want them to want to do it. If you're having to force someone in, that happens sometimes. I get it. Sometimes you're compelling or pressing somebody in. But in the large case, we really want folks that want to do it. I think another thing that comes up, and Terry's going to talk about this next one, is at least to start with, in many ways, we don't know how to grow. It's so unfamiliar to us. Terry, what's your experience there?
Well, I can say a couple of things, and we'll take this a couple different ways. But one of those is I think we have far too corporate of an approach to growth. And what I mean by that is we believe that the way to grow is to hire someone to do that for us. And so usually that falls on the preacher evangelist shoulders. And in some places, we'll hire a second evangelist only to focus on outside growth. And the problem with that is, by the way, that evangelism specifically and church growth, that is an obligation that is placed on the shoulders of every disciple within a local work. And one of the failures of not knowing how is we're trying to go about it the wrong way. I think my job and Phil's job as an evangelist, and to the preachers listening, our job as an evangelist is more to equip the people on how to help the church grow rather than to take the burden of growing the church. Now, in regards to that, let me talk about one of the great failures that most of us have in the equipping phase, and that is this. We tend to believe there is only one way to teach the gospel. And that gets exponentially more of a problem when I'm the one that's devised that plan. Over the years, I've met with and talked to a lot of guys who are often classified as evangelism experts, and they have their own plan. And I've been in those conversations where they're quick to tell me how this is and I've heard some of them say, this is the only way to teach the gospel. And whenever I hear that phrase, I just internally kind of cringe because there's not just one way to teach the gospel. In fact, in the area of knowing how to grow, and part of that is knowing that every person may have to have a different way of being taught. And what works for one individual you're teaching doesn't work for another. And so we have to plan and teach and equip on how to do that on more of a broad scale than giving somebody the latest, greatest evangelism book. Not to pick on anybody, I use a lot of material. Ken Craig's Big Picture of the Bible, I love that material. Doesn't work for everybody. But we need to know that material. We also need to know Mark Roberts' Seeking God's Way. We also need to know Rick Billingsley's, simple questions approach, the Nathan approach he calls it. We also need to be able to just open the Bible like to the book of Mark and read a chapter at a time with somebody and be able to teach the gospel that way. And there's a lot more approaches besides that. So not only do we outsource to just one person, but then we also think that there's only one way to do it. And whenever you get so pigeonholed into one way or one person, you're failing to know how to grow in that area.
Yeah, and I'll quarter it into our context here for our primary audience, which is preachers. We take that stress on ourselves. If it doesn't work, then it is immediately our fault. Whatever we've schemed up or designed and said, this is our plan for evangelism. Oh, it didn't work. Well, I failed, and now I'm going to have to do this a different way. And then we try to learn a whole new way. It's still not the way that works for us and works for our immediate contact, let's say. And that one will fail. The next one might fail. And then we have so crept off of our mission that nothing's getting done. So my suggestion is, and we want to think about it this way, is we pivot the preacher back to his work, to broadly equipping the saints to do their corner of the work. And that's a failing on preachers, by the way. And I'm sure Terry could probably, confirm that that's something he's recognized for himself. That if we tilt off that edge and get so far removed from what that work should be, the church won't grow. When we tilt back, we start equipping them, the church absolutely grows. In part because that's God designed it, but also in part because everyone's doing their little part of the work. And that's little part for the preacher, little part for other aspects. And even included in that is the secondary aspects of what growth looks like and how growth can actually be manifested. I'll include this right here, and Terry already mentioned the corporate structure of things. There are numbers that we track for everything in life because that's how humans are kind of interacting with the world in ways. And so we might track baptisms or even retention of new converts and say, there we go, there's growth. I'll suggest to you that in a practical way, that while one of those two numbers is better than the other, that's not exactly what God is looking for us to put our thumbtack on and say, this is when I know I'm doing the work that makes us grow. It may be a fruit of growth, but it's not the work itself by any means.
Yeah, and I would just say it this way. We don't understand what evangelism really is in regards to those numbers. Evangelism is not successful when you have a baptism. Evangelism is successful when the word of God has been taught, regardless of whether that person obeys. And I think sometimes we get so locked into the numbers of baptism that we don't remember successful evangelism doesn't always end in a baptism. It ends in the truth being taught. Now, let me say quickly about, you mentioned retention, and we'll move on for time. One of the interesting things about retention is I'm not sure we track retention as much as we should. Of those two numbers, I would think it is the more important of the two. And the reason I say we don't track retention is evangelism, because we pigeonhole it as a baptism, we believe that once we baptize somebody, we're done. And what happens in a lot of places, we started tracking our retention at the last work I was at about 4 years ago when Adam Shanks and I were working together. And our retention of those people, we had large numbers of baptisms over about a 6-7 year period, but because we went back in time to do that, but our retention was less than 30%. Yeah. And you got to think about that. If you're baptizing 150 people, but you can't keep more than maybe 30 of that 150, your evangelism approach is failing because you're not saving people. In fact, you're giving them a false hope. So the retention number is an important one to look at because I think along this ways it's learning from your mistakes. One of the things you've got to do is if you're not keeping people saved because you're not doing anything with them, you need to change what you're doing in order to make sure that you can teach them and help them grow.
Yeah, and that's going to require a reprioritization of who does what work, and who does each of those portions. And one of the things that is really going to help that aspect become more apparent is lifting up leadership, raising up men, raising up families, because leadership goes more than just the congregational construct there, to be aids and assistants in that work. That's something that they thrive on, and that you can have elders and leaders in various roles to kind of shepherd the folks, catch that term, shepherd the folks into the best spots for their talents. And so when you reprioritize and say growth is important, and as a part of growth, retention is important, if you're going to use that term, then we need to ground people in the truth. And someone may really be really good at getting a study. Somebody else may be really good at having that first study, but a third person is really good about securing that person as a stable Bible student. And so you've got to learn to pass the football off to get that full touchdown at the end.
Yeah, and by the way, before we move to the number 2 on the list, we're building our way up to number 1. If only the preacher's involved in all those processes, he can't do all of that. I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. There's no way he can do all the studies, all the conversions, and all the retention. And that's one of the failures of the corporate approach of having one guy focus on evangelism. It's just not possible to have one guy carry all of that burden. And it sets up a system of failure because we take all that on. And then when we fail, we believe we failed, and leadership often believes we failed, but it's a flawed approach to begin with. It will never work that way. So let's move on.
I'll add one more tip.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things you can do, even in smaller groups, is to find your Timothy and to find your Titus. Even if they're not supported by the local work there to engage fully in that work, find someone to help you with it. That, hey, I need to go on vacation this week. Here's my Timothy. I'm taking my family to go visit other family. Timothy's got it. And so that's just a little tidbit. We'll probably talk about that in the future, about finding your Timothy, finding your Titus, being a Paul, being a Barnabas, and so on. But and that's a great kind of transition, because if you're not willing to find someone to help you, you're probably not willing to grow at all. And I think a lot of times one of the biggest reasons that churches don't grow is we simply don't want to.
Yeah, that's number 2, by the way, for those keeping track. We don't want to grow. Phil, talk a little bit more about that.
Well, here's something to think about. Our comfort zones define us. And I've got a quick apocryphal, maybe fable tale. It's the tale of 4 or 5 monkeys. And you stick them in a room, you put a banana on the top of a ladder, and every time one monkey goes to the top, an air blast, a water blast, pushes that monkey back down. And so eventually they all get satisfied with the idea that getting up to that banana is bad. And then you slowly start swapping out the monkeys. And then that new monkey will try to climb the ladder. Well, and then eventually, you know what happens? Everyone starts, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Until eventually there's no new monkeys, but nobody's climbing the ladder. We're afraid of making whatever changes might be necessary to grow because of a perception of failure in the past. Now, there's some risks there, and we'll talk about that too. But I think a lot of times we have that fabled view of, we can't do it because we tried it before, we went door knocking before, or we went out and we did this at a fair before and it didn't work, so why should we do it again? And we're comfortable how we are. If we change, or we have to get a new building, or if we move to a new location, it just won't be the same anymore.
Yeah, I'll use my family as an example of that. There's times like Sunday we had a group meeting at our house. There was 30 people at our house with our family all total and eating lunch, and that was really fun. But there are times I just want to go home and not have anybody around me, and put on my comfortable clothes and not be pushed, and not have to worry about cleaning my house, and not having to worry about how things look. And when it's just my family, I'm pretty comfortable, and I don't have to worry about what I say, and I don't have to worry about what I do, and if there's enough food and all of those kind of things. And there's a certain amount of comfort in just being my family and nobody else around. And I think we adapt that to the church. That growth, by the way, is messy. There's a lot of complications with growth. For one, go back to the house analogy. I have 1 or 2 places in my house I like to sit. I have my chair, But when people come over, sometimes I lose my seat. And I don't like that because I like
Yeah.
my chair. And at church, if you ever walk through, the preachers get to do this. We get to walk through an empty church building and we get to see all the marked seats, the left Bibles and blankets and stools and all of those signs. And I know part of that's convenience, but there's also another part of that says, hey, this is my seat. Don't sit there. When you grow, you may lose your seat. Somebody might sit too close to you. I don't want that. Not only that, some growth brings about problems. You know, saving the world in some senses can be difficult, messy, more benevolence, more aftercare, and that's a difficult process as well. True evangelism doesn't select which people you save. You save anybody and everybody. And if we go out and we save, let's just say, some former felon who then comes in amongst us, how do we deal with that? That's a messy process. All of that's uncomfortable. And so not only is it the past rejections and what we tried causes us to just not want to grow, but sometimes we grow. And I've been in places where we were growing, and some people, the older members been there a while, say, well, where did these people come from? That's what evangelism looks like sometimes, is people you're not comfortable with.
Yeah, and we don't grow in some context in this regard. We don't even want to grow because our focus has changed. Our focus is so much on the inside and say, oh, we got to have these great Bible classes, and we're so terrified that our children are going to fall away, so we try to ramp up our Bible classes, and our eyes get so closed inwardly that we don't even conceptually think that growth is even possible anymore on a structural level. Let me just tell you something. This is a practical truth borne out by 28 years of being in Christ and more than 20 years of preaching. The single indicator of spiritual success in children that are raised in the church, if you will, is going to be on the involvement of their parents raising them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. A, that's biblical. You know, that's the Bible's direct connection. And B, it's anecdotally practical. There is nothing else more significant to that than that. And we'll probably talk about that as maybe an entire package in the future. But I wanted to drop that right here and say, if that's your big focus for the local church and you care more about the kids' Bible classes than anything else, I applaud your effort and I'm thankful for your presence. But there also needs to be effort put into growth. And that might be in the adult Bible class, but it's often going to be in a lot of other things than just making sure you have the prettiest, nicest, well-arranged Bible class.
Yes, and additionally, I will say, as far as looking inwardly, I think sometimes our problem is that a lot of churches are just trying to maintain the membership they have, and they're so overwhelmed with that in a state of declining churches in America. I think one of the reports said less than 20% of churches are growing, and of that, less than 5% are growing through spiritual procreation, meaning a lot of churches grow just by having more kids. There's kind of been a kid explosion lately. I don't know if you've realized that. So from that standpoint, we can kind of get caught in that cycle too of we're working so hard just to keep our own people faithful. We don't have time to try to teach other people. You can't do that as well. You've got to make sure that there's some form of, I'm going to use a term makes people uncomfortable, but outreach. And that's really what we're talking about. And by the way, outreach usually happens outside of your assembly and Bible classes. And that's part of the key is you've got to do something in addition to the 3 to 4 hours a week you're doing already in order to grow the church.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this keys into what Terry and I would probably agree is the single most important factor as to why some churches don't grow. I don't think we trust God enough. The scriptures remind us that God gives the increase. He doesn't go into great detail about his process and what that looks like. But I want to tell you something. I've heard and I've said things that I think are defeatist and improper. Oh, the ground is so hard here. I don't know why this is not working. All of those things in the end were very much more about me than about the gospel or about God. And until we grapple with the reality that if you want to be part of the solution, you have to acknowledge maybe you've been part of the problem as a concept. you're not going to grow past this. And if you begin to trust God and say, yes, it will increase as God desires, you'll find yourself getting out of the way a little bit, and you'll reevaluate his fences, because he builds fences at times, and he won't start taking those down. And instead you'll saying, where does he want us to flow? Where does he want us to be? Where is he pushing us?
Yeah, it's interesting. I heard somebody say one time, well, these people don't want to change, or these people don't want to be saved. And that mentality, we don't realize it, but that denies the power of the gospel. In Romans, there's a lot of passages, but when he says there that the gospel has power, we've got to believe that. And it's interesting that it's the gospel in Romans 6 that has the ability to take us from the slave of bondage into a slave of freedom. And we've got to trust that more than we do. And we've got to trust that sometimes just sharing the gospel, we'll find people that want the truth. Not everybody, we're told that. But we need to trust God to give the increase. And we just don't do that enough. And all these other reasons really are probably kind of fingers of that one problem, is that we don't trust God. And that may be the core reason, is we just don't trust the gospel and God enough to save souls and give increase today. There was a question given to us here about the 80% occupancy being full. We talked about that earlier. I don't know if it's Dan or Sheila. I'm assuming probably Dan. But he said, at what percentage that looks too empty? And the small congregations sometimes think we have too many pews. People will think us as distant and cold just because of empty pews. I want to make sure we answer that. I am a believer. By the way, 50% is really prime growth percentage. And I believe that it's around 40% that you need to consider maybe taking out seats. Now, I say that to just simply also follow up with this. A lot of people have a problem with that. They have a real problem with removing pews and creating more blank space without pews, and then forcing people to sit together. And I've only seen probably just a handful of churches that did that willingly. Because we're not willing. That's one of those physical things we kind of look down upon and say is silly. I do believe there's something to be said about that, especially in churches that seem to be on the decline. If you move in an area, Phil, and there's a 200 occupancy church and there's 35 people spread out over those pews, whether it's true or not, your picture of that is, this is a dead church and I want no part of that.
It's where did everyone go?
Yeah.
Where did all the people go? I'll give you quick tips from my own experience. They're not the best ones, perhaps. Maybe there's better ones to consider to kind of interact with. One, consider interlocking chairs in place of pews. That makes them extremely flexible in regards to your numbers there. You can pull more out for gospel meetings, put it back into storage when you have your home folk. They actually increase your occupancy. Typically, you can get more people in those chairs than you can get into pews in a lot of places. So that's another way to kind of address this. And also, if you're going to remove pews, and sometimes you should, sometimes you need to, just increase some of the spacing and look at your room as a tool, not a shrine. If your auditorium, your teaching space is a tool, then you'll see it in a whole different light, and it can be an advantage rather than a disadvantage. And yeah, that 50 to 80 spread is optimal. As an example, where we're at Eastside, there are a lot of Sundays where my family can't sit together. Sometimes they choose not to sit together, and my wife doesn't really know what it's like to sit with me because I'm preaching all of the time. And that's just how it is for preachers. But some Sundays, it's, parking lot's an issue, building inside is an issue. We got to work through it because when we have visitors come, the question is, where do I fit in? Everyone still wants to have their pew, their spot, even if it's not physical.
Along those lines, I would encourage preachers on those kind of facility questions and those kind of things. If you've not seen Tom Rainer's book, I think I have it over here, Becoming a Welcoming Church. If you've not seen that, I would encourage you to get that. And he goes over a lot of simple things. It's only about 100 pages. We have the interlocking chairs where I'm at. And one of the beautiful things is right now they're kind of spread out. I mean, I'm a tall guy. I have the most room I've ever had while in an assembly. But we were at 75% occupancy on Sunday. And so I told a couple of the guys, time to put another row in. And so we can scoot that kind of rowing together closer, and we can have more seats in order to fit more people. And also because everyone has their own seat, you eliminate a lot of the unnecessary courtesy space between families on pews that often happens. And sometimes people treat that seating more like an aircraft and everybody takes their own seat, which is a nice thing. Why you could sometimes squeeze even that 80% up to 85% in a pinch and
Yeah.
without people leaving. One more
Yeah.
question, then we need to cut it out.
Yeah.
Was why would outreach be problematic? I'm the one that said that. I'll just say because it's viewed as purely a denominational term at times. It should not be. It's a good term, but sometimes we have trouble. Maybe that's another episode of the religious words we have sacrificed to
Yeah.
the idea of denominationalism. But it's one of those words that makes people a little nervous, like the word revival, for instance, which we also get nervous about.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'll just answer it from my perspective because I think it's an important language thing. If God in Christ uses a story, a parable, to talk about sending out servants to compel people to come in, I think it's okay for us to reach out and
Yeah.
pull somebody in.
Yeah.
And that's really but we get trapped into, I heard someone use it this way. And so if you use that same word, you must mean exactly everything they say and also believe everything they believe because you're just like them, aren't you?
Right.
And that's another defeatist train. The more we trust in God, the less we're going to trust in some of these broken systems of our own invention or our own mistakes in the past.
Similar to the use of the word pastor, and I intentionally use that to refer to what we call elders, but some people are very uncomfortable with that because we've kind of given that biblical word up because we don't want to take the time to explain the difference. And so that's the reason for that. Anything to add, Phil? We're out of time.
Now, I think this is a great starter conversation. I want to encourage folks, some about what we haven't been doing. Two things are going to take place, but one of them is even after the program airs, if you want to continue to talk and discuss these subjects below the video or in other ways, that's great. And like Terry said at the beginning, please share the page, invite people to the page, go a little button that says invite your friends. The best thing that can happen for Terry and I is to get better. And we need folks who are going to be at times critical of our ideas to correct misunderstandings we might have, but they also might bring in some good insight and some good perspective that here I don't have. We don't have that experience. We never did that. We were never there. We never saw that. And so bringing in a larger crowd of witnesses, if you will help both of us get better. And I'd love for folks to do that.
Absolutely. We're still in the growth phase of life and still learning, even though we have gray hair. That never ends. And so if
I don't
somebody
have
could
any
help
gray
us with
hair.
that, yeah, if somebody could help us with that, we would certainly be thankful for that. And again, share away, like away. You can also send us private messages if you have something you want to be more private. But also the other thing I wanted to say is if there's some kind of subject you want to cover in the future, let us know that, and we'll try to work that in.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. We've really appreciated your presence here, and we really hope that in some small or significant way, we've allowed you to grow in your understanding of what the work of a preacher is and what it is we can do to share in that work, and more broadly, that a larger segment of the body of Christ gets more actively involved in sowing the seed.
Absolutely.
Take care, everybody.
All right, bye.